On July 20th, 2002, about 33 years after Neil Armstrong took his first steps on the moon, astronaut hopeful Thad Roberts took his first steps into an Italian restaurant in Orlando, Florida. And while that sounds less impressive, this NASA intern was about to make history in his own way by completing the biggest heist that the space agency had ever seen. By the way, you like the vibe in here? It's very good. He already had the goods. All he needed to do was complete the sale. Inside that restaurant, Roberts and two accomplices met the relatives of a Belgian mineral collector who had agreed to pay $100,000 for roughly 100 grams of moon rocks Roberts had stolen from Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. The group talked, agreed to terms, then headed to the hotel where the thieves had stored the loot. But as soon as they entered the parking lot, FBI agents swarmed around them. Roberts and his crew weren't sure yet what had gone wrong, but they were in a lot of trouble. This story is about more than the infamous Roberts heist, though. Over the years, hundreds of moon rocks from the Apollo missions have vanished. Some of them due to negligence, others due to political assassinations, others just plain theft. And around the same time Roberts was scheming to steal lunar samples from the Johnson Space Center, another man there was devoting his life to getting them back. NASA Special Agent Joseph Goodhines was investigating the sale of fake moon rocks when he discovered a thriving black market for the real thing. His career tracking down those rocks would uncover stolen and misplaced pieces of the moon around the world. This is the story of an unlikely group of villains and heroes who, for their own reasons, became obsessed with a few gray pebbles. And as it turns out, those pebbles have a lot to teach us, not just about the moon, but about ourselves. Luna, Celine, Aunt Debbie, whatever you call it, the moon has been our planet's constant companion for about 4.5 billion years. And throughout history, we've pondered what it was and how it came to be. But it wasn't until 1610, when Galileo Galilei used one of the first telescopes, that we could start to answer those questions. Galileo's sketches revealed a barren, dry, and airless world covered in mountains and craters. There were no oceans or living inhabitants, at least none that left a mark on the surface. But while telescopes helped reveal what the moon was not, they didn't help much with figuring out what it was.
We had a very poor understanding of what the moon was made of. Had almost no information about it.
That's Professor Sarah Russell, the leader of the Planetary Materials Group at the Natural History Museum in London.
One of the great mysteries was how the moon got there, and there were lots of theories. There was a theory that it could have separated away from the Earth just by them spinning around. It could have been a captured asteroid. But no one really knew.
To decide between those theories and answer other questions about the moon, scientists needed to learn about its composition, but there was only so much they could glean from more than 360,000 kilometers away. The Apollo missions changed all of that. I mean, yes, one of the reasons 12 NASA astronauts bounced around on the moon was to stick it to the Soviet Union, but from 1969 to 1972, Apollo astronauts also completed a suite of scientific objectives, including collecting rock samples from the lunar surface. And when they came back to Earth, so did those samples, roughly 2,200 of them, weighing 382 kilograms in total. That's about 1/5 of a Kia Sorento. No, we're not going to do that this episode.
That's like a room full of rocks. It's a lot of material. So as well as the kind of big rocks that were brought back, there's also a lot of what's called regolith, which is the fine-grained material on the surface of the moon. There's some rock cores as well. It's a proper geology collection that samples the whole diversity of the places where the astronauts visited.
It turns out the moon's geology, at least the bits that Apollo astronauts visited, is a lot less complex than Earth's.
There's what's called the Highland Rock, and when you look up to the moon on a clear night, that's the white stuff that covers most of the moon, and that's made of a rock called anorthosite. And we think this is the oldest rock on the moon. And then the dark splodges that you can see on the moon, that's a different kind of rock called basalt. And these formed later when there were big impacts into the surface of the moon that triggered remelting and resurfacing of those areas. But then a lot of the lunar rocks have had quite a complicated history from being affected by being impacted all the time. So a lot of the rocks are mixtures of different sort of rocks that have been jumbled together.
Samples of the moon might not make for the most attractive rock collection, but they are critical for scientific research. Remote data from telescopes and orbiting probes gives us the general idea, but each rock sample offers an opportunity to study the lunar surface on a fine scale and paint a much more precise picture of the moon's composition, geologic processes, and history. As a result, NASA treats all of its moon rocks with the utmost reverence. Around 3/4 of all the Apollo samples are stored at NASA's Johnson Space Center. Most of the rest are kept at a facility in White Sands, New Mexico, but at the JSC, the rocks are kept in what's known as the Lunar Sample Laboratory facility inside Building 31N. This essentially windowless room was built to withstand most major weapons, and because it's in Houston, it's also watertight and hurricane-proof. Inside the laboratory, the rocks are surrounded by inert nitrogen gas and are kept inside sealed glove cabinets so that they can be handled without the Earth's atmosphere contaminating them. Anything or anyone that wants to enter has to be thoroughly cleaned first. All of this is kept behind a strict security system that requires 2 people to open the door, similar to the safeguards behind nuclear missile launches. As such, the Lunar Sample Laboratory at JSC is considered as secure as any Federal Reserve Bank or Fort Knox. So if you're a scientist who wants to get your hand on a moon rock, it's a whole process.
One of the glorious things about the Johnson Space Center curation facility is that they do allow and invite researchers all around the world to apply for their materials to use for their research. You have to write a little proposal to say what you're going to do and how much you need and what the effect will be and what the outcomes of your project will be. But then they consider your request, and as a result, there are pieces of Apollo rocks that are in labs across the world.
Of course, NASA isn't about to hand out samples to anybody who asks for them. Now, if you are a scientist lucky enough to get a lunar rock to work on, you have to take as much care as NASA itself, including locking it up in your own vault for safekeeping. And after you've finished with your experiments, NASA wants their samples back.
You absolutely do not get to keep it at the end. At the end of your study, you wrap it up very carefully and you send it back to the curation center. Yeah, there's no souvenirs.
But despite all of the security and protocols, the allure of owning a moon rock, or making money by selling them, is occasionally, apparently, just too much for some to resist. Thad Roberts was a model student right up until he wasn't. Born into a Mormon family in Utah, he was disowned by his parents and the church as a young man. He married his high school sweetheart, Katie, and was determined to make a life for himself. At 23, he enrolled at the University of Utah to study geology, physics, and geophysics, and while he was there, he ran the university's astronomical society and volunteered at Utah's Museum of Natural History. He raised thousands of dollars in a charity bike ride and had his private pilot's license and scuba qualifications. With such an impressive resume, it was little wonder that in 2000 he was accepted into NASA's prestigious cooperative education program. This initiative gave interns 3 so-called tours at Johnson Space Center between continuing their studies and gave them exposure to some of the work that NASA scientists do, as well as opportunities for future employment. Many applicants, including Roberts, aspired to be astronauts and saw the program as a way to get a foot in the door. But that made it highly competitive. The acceptance rate at that time was only around 6%. By all accounts, Roberts thrived during his co-op experience. During his first 2 tours at JSC, he flexed his geological muscles, learning how to prepare meteorites and terrestrial rocks for later study. And this work took place in Building 31N, home to the Lunar Sample Laboratory, and scientists like Professor Everett Gibson, who had been studying moon rocks and meteorites for the last 30 years. The 2 men didn't work together directly, but they did have a few encounters. Roberts even introduced Gibson to his wife when she visited the campus. At that meeting, Gibson gifted Katie a small piece of meteorite, but Roberts came away with something more valuable: an idea. Gibson stored the lunar samples he worked on not in the high-security Lunar Sample Laboratory, but in a 5-drawer safe inside his office. And that meant the professor's moon rocks had been out of the inert nitrogen atmosphere of the lab. They were nowhere near as valuable as they once were.
There are some projects that you just can't do except on a pristine sample. So one example might be looking at the noble gas abundances. So it could be that any sample that's experienced the Earth's atmosphere will be contaminated for those sorts of analyses.
But Roberts wondered if these contaminated moon rocks might still be valuable to somebody outside NASA. Gibson's safe was locked and his office was locked, but compared to getting past the Lunar Sample Laboratory security, it was a walk in the park. Plus, when the professor had opened his safe to retrieve Katie's meteorite, Roberts saw him reference a card stuck to the safe and assumed that that must have been the code. That would be one obstacle already taken care of. If Roberts could somehow get his hands on those scientifically worthless samples, he could cash in on rocks that he thought wouldn't even really be missed. It was, he convinced himself, a victimless crime. Now maybe all this sounds like it's a little out of character for a model student and aspiring astronaut, but Roberts' resume didn't paint the whole picture. In fact, this wasn't the first theft he had attempted. While he was volunteering for Utah's Natural History Museum, several impressive fossils found their way to his house. He claimed that they had been given to him, but the truth was he had simply helped himself. Back in Building 31N, Roberts began conceiving a plan to steal the moon rocks from Gibson's safe. He knew he wouldn't be able to get them on his own, so in 2002 he put together a team of like-minded troublemakers. His first recruit was Gordon McWhorter, a student he met at the university's Utah Astronomical Club. Like Roberts, McWhorter was estranged from his family. He'd already had a run-in with the law and by his own admission was a pretty heavy user of recreational drugs. As a result, he knew his way around some of the shadier parts of society, including the early 2000s internet, which I don't remember as very shady. Mostly it was like All Your Base Are Belong to Us and X-Files fan forums. After becoming friends, Roberts floated the idea of perhaps maybe selling some moon rocks. Eventually, McWhorter agreed and helped him look for a buyer. Because it's not like you could post an ad on Facebook Marketplace. Facebook didn't exist in 2002. We were still a year out from MySpace at that point. So, on March 9th, McWhorter posted on a few message boards based outside the US, advertising priceless moon rocks now available. He followed this up with emails to various European mineral collectors under the alias Orb Robinson, which I love. Turns out this is based on his favorite musician, Roy Orbison, who, it turns out, is also somebody who studied geology. I didn't know that the Big O studied geology in college, but there you have it. Eventually, McWhorter got a Belgian collector to bite, and then handed the email address over to Roberts. His part in the heist was basically complete. Next on Roberts' team was Tiffany Fowler, a 22-year-old co-op at Johnson Space Center. She had just graduated with a degree in biology at Texas Lutheran University and was working in JSC's tissue culture lab. Although Roberts was married, he fell hard for Fowler when they met. A passionate affair began, and less than a month before he planned to steal the moon rocks, he brought his new love in on this scheme. Rounding out the roster was 19-year-old Shay Sauer, an engineering intern and straight-A student with 2 years of college credits at Lamar University. We don't actually know much about how or why she ended up getting involved, but both Fowler and Sauer would ultimately join Roberts as his boots on the ground, with the promise of a cut of any sale he made. By July, the crew was set to do the unthinkable: rob NASA. But Roberts had good reason to believe he could make a fortune selling a bunch of gray stones. There was something of a precedent, which lawyer and one-time special agent Joseph Gutheinz knew all too well. But before I tell you about that, a quick ad. When we were working on this script, one thing that became very obvious to us was that the thing that most protected moon rocks was people caring about moon rocks. When people started caring less, that's when they started to be in danger of being lost. I was actually recently in the Natural History Museum in London, and the moon rock that the US gave to the UK is in like the highest honor gallery there, the Treasures Gallery. They care about that moon rock, and that is what protects it. The story we're telling here today is about someone putting their foot down and saying, this matters, we have to care. And I think that is 100% the right take, both for science reasons and for human history reasons. Which is why I worked together with my friend and designer Matthew Gatos to make this. It is a Moon Rock Protection Squad shirt. Because protection starts with caring, and I have a feeling a lot of people watching this right now do care. If you care about keeping these rocks safe and well documented, you are part of the Moon Rock Protection Squad, whether you get a shirt or not. But if you want one, I think they're cool. So the way we're doing this is it's a pre-order because we have no idea how many we're going to sell. So that pre-order starts today, and then 2 weeks from now, we'll take it down and then print the exact amount that get ordered. And then it will never be available again. You can get it at complexly.store/MRPS, which we have decided is pronounced MERPS. And of course, if you get it, that will also help to support SciShow. Thanks. Now, back to the story. Guttheinz started out in the military. Born the son of Marines, he served in the Army as an aviator and intelligence officer. After he left, he became a special agent for the Federal Aviation Administration and then the Department of Transportation. Eventually, he caught the attention of NASA.
They liked what I was doing. They brought me into the agency, made me a senior special agent, and that's where I really started to have fun. Any law enforcement agent and any pilot is naturally gravitated towards NASA. It's like the ultimate, right? If you're a law enforcement agent, there's no other place you want to be a law enforcement officer than NASA.
In 1990, Guttheinz was recruited into NASA's Office of the Inspector General, or OIG. It's on the same level as the FBI and the Secret Service, and is dedicated to rooting out crime, fraud, and waste. And while he was enrolled in law school at night, he found himself stationed at Johnson Space Center.
For most of the time I was at Johnson Space Center, I worked in a high security facility. It had like 2-foot brick walls all around it. It was partially buried under the ground. There were safe doors that you would have to go through to get from one place to the next, or cipher locks that would open up doors. I was running a 25-man and woman task force investigation that resulted in the largest count indictment and conviction in NASA history.
Throughout his 10-year career as a NASA special agent, Guttheinz worked on a variety of cases, many of which demonstrated that despite its bunker-like buildings, cipher locks, and two-party vault doors, NASA security really wasn't all it was cracked up to be. He investigated problems and fraud concerning the space shuttles, he investigated the Mir space station project, through which some Russians were billing NASA for their million-dollar homes, and he investigated individuals who made it much farther into NASA's facilities than they should have.
In June of 1998, I had just arrested Jerry Allen Whitridge, that some called the great astronaut impersonator. He got into mission control during the space mission, got the schematics to the shuttle propulsion system, VIP tours to Navy bases, etc. But he claimed to be a Congressional Medal of Honor winner, Top Gun trophy winner, astronaut S1, there's no such thing, and CIA assassin. And based on that resume, he got into mission control. And so I arrested the guy.
While doing this work, Guttheinz became aware of a minor but pernicious crime that was becoming more and more common: the selling of bogus moon rocks. This con actually started straight after Apollo 11, with door-to-door salesmen offering so-called lunar rocks to people who weren't aware of the security and legality around them. Most of these marks were just everyday folks caught up in the excitement of the Apollo program, so they wouldn't know the difference. And if they ever had doubts, getting actual confirmation would mean revealing that you now had something you legally weren't allowed to have. So these people often ended up paying a lot of money for a plain old Earth rock and a clever lie. Seeing the average Joe getting conned while also undermining the work NASA was doing really got under Guttheinz's skin. So in 1998, while waiting for that astronaut impersonator to show up in court, he decided to do something about it.
And I decided, well, you know what? I'm not going to wait for these con artists to come to our attention. I'm going to go after the con artists with a sting operation.
For Operation Lunar Eclipse, as it became known, Guttheinz basically set up a fake company called John's Estate Sales. He assumed the alias Tony Coriasso and pretended to be working for a wealthy client. On behalf of this fake company, Guttheinz put a quarter-page ad in USA Today. It featured a picture of an astronaut jumping on the moon and a headline, "Moon Rocks Wanted," and a phone number for potential sellers to call.
About 10, 14, 12 days later, we get a call on my dedicated hello line. And I go over, listen to the recording. A guy by the name of Alan Rosen says, "I got a moon rock." Great. I'm expecting it to be a con artist. Call the guy back up. "Hello, this is Tony Coriasso. I'm with John's Estate Sales. Well, so you have a moon rock?" He said, "Absolutely, but don't believe any of the other people trying to sell you a moon rock, because they're bogus. I got the real thing."
Goodhines, of course, was used to this kind of claim. Every con man wants to convince you that theirs is the only offer worth considering. But when he saw a picture of the rock Rosen was offering, he realized he might actually be dealing with the real thing, because it looked an awful lot like a Goodwill rock. See, not every rock that the Apollo astronauts brought back wound up in NASA storage or in scientists' labs. In fact, hundreds of tiny moon rocks were intentionally distributed all over the world.
The Nixon administration decided to give 135 nations of the world, the members of the United Nations, friends and foes alike, a moon rock from the Apollo 11 mission and a moon rock from the Apollo 17 moon rock mission.
They did the same for the 50 US states. So in total, 370 Goodwill rocks were given out between 1969 and 1973. Each consisted of a few pieces of dust or a pea-sized piece of moon rock encased in a ball of a resin called lucite. The ball was then mounted on a wooden plaque with the recipient's country or state flag. These Goodwill rocks were gifted to the people of those nations and states and were intended to be displayed as a symbol of human achievement. But now, one was being offered to John's estate sales.
The name of the recipient country is blocked out, and the center of the flag is blocked out. I'm going like, oh, that's real clever. I got the rest of the flag, I just am missing the center. And the reason why that was clever is that there are 6 countries in Central and South America with exactly the same flag. And lo and behold, the center is the only thing that's different on any of them. And so now I knew there was one of 6 countries that this moon rock could be from, and we started looking into it. And country after country, I ran into the same problem. The recipient nations didn't know, 1, that they even got the moon rocks, or 2, where they were.
He might not have known exactly which Goodwill rock he was dealing with, but Goodhines was pretty sure he'd just found a real missing moon rock in an operation meant to catch fakes. Rosen was asking for $5 million in exchange, apparently based on black market rates, and he wouldn't even show the goods until he'd seen proof of the cash.
And I thought, no problem. Called up NASA. We're not going to put up $5 million for that. Called Department of Justice. No way. NASA OIG calls up CIA. Can't get the $5 million.
So Goodhines turned to an unlikely source, someone he knew had helped people out in the past, billionaire businessman and one-time presidential candidate Ross Perot.
He's like one of the richest guys in the United States. I got through to his secretary. Said, yeah, we need to see if he'll loan some money to us. We're trying to get back a national treasure. And she says, sure, I'll let him know.
And just moments later, Goodhines got a call.
Ring, ring. Pick up the phone. Hello. Hello, Joe. This is Ross Perot. How can I help you? I said, well, Mr. Perot, we need $5 million to get back a moon rock. No problem. And that was it.
Perot might have been able to cough up $5 million like it was spare change, and of course, it would never actually leave his bank account if NASA's sting was successful, but that's an incredibly high asking price for 1 gram of rock. Which begs the question, what is a moon rock actually worth anyway? Many people would argue that their greatest value lies in what they represent.
I remember I was just a small child and I used to get excited about everything. But with the Apollo missions, even the adults were excited. And I remember being astounded that adults could get so excited about something.
At places like the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum and Space Center Houston, visitors can physically touch a piece of the moon. And for many people, that can be a transformative experience.
I went to an astronaut. A famous astronaut, and I said, hey, look, do you think $5 million is reasonable for 1.142 grams of rock? He said, you know, Joe, I have no clue. But he said, I'll tell you this story. He said, when I was a kid, I always wanted to be a pilot. And he said, I went to a museum and I started coming up to this display with a moon rock. And somewhere between the point that I started to the point that I got to the moon rock, I no longer just wanted to be a pilot. I wanted to be an astronaut.
Apollo lunar samples are essentially the rarest rocks on Earth. We don't have the technology or budget to easily replace them. But in a way, they'll always be irreplaceable. They're relics of a singular time in world history, representing a temporary peace in an otherwise tense and expensive arms race between the US and the USSR.
I can look up in the night sky and I can see where this sample came from, and yet I can hold it in my hand, holding something that somebody selected over 50 years ago, chose, and then made this treacherous journey to the moon and back to bring it for me to look at in my lab. That's a real privilege to be able to do that.
History is important, but lunar rocks do, of course, have value beyond symbolism. It's been more than 50 years since Apollo 17 returned with one last set of moon rocks, and in that time, NASA has received thousands of research requests from hundreds of scientists in more than 15 countries. The agency has distributed around 50,000 samples for use in scientific fields ranging from astronomy to biology, chemistry, engineering, materials science, medicine, and geology. Studying these samples have solved many scientific mysteries about the moon itself, as well as the Earth and the rest of the solar system.
If we have a physical lunar sample, we do all sorts of microscopy on it. So that includes optical microscopy using light, but also using electron microscopy, which means that we can get down to really tiny samples and look at it on a very, very small scale, which gives us a much better idea of how the minerals formed. And then we can also do chemical analyses, which enable us to compare it to the Earth and to other bodies.
The moon doesn't have plate tectonics or any kind of air or water to erode the surface, so pristine Apollo rocks are all at least 3 billion years old. They retain a record of early solar system events that you can't find anywhere else. They've even helped researchers understand a whole other kind of rock in their collections. Basically, until we went up and collected pristine bits of the moon, we didn't know that pieces of it had already crashed into the Earth in the form of meteorites. But probably most significantly, the Apollo samples helped us solve the mystery of how the moon got there in the first place.
They were incredibly dry compared to Earth rocks, so they had lost water and lots of other volatile elements as well. But apart from that, in lots of kind of chemical signatures, they were identical to the Earth. And that means that somehow their genesis was linked to that of the Earth, but they had lost something.
These observations not only discounted the ideas of the moon being captured by Earth's gravity or forming alongside it, but they lent support to another controversial hypothesis from the 1940s. The hypothesis was that not long after the Earth formed, it was hit by another Mars-sized planet. The impact vaporized and liquefied the colliding planet, plus a lot of the Earth's outer layers. Everything mixed together, and eventually, the moon formed from the debris.
So that's why they got similar compositions. But then as the spray that comes out, a lot of it evaporates into space, so that affects its composition.
Ultimately, the Apollo moon rocks helped to establish the entire field of modern planetary science, and their contribution is just as significant today as it was 50 years ago.
Once they're back on Earth forever, and so we can use them, but also our descendants in 200 years' time can use them to answer questions that we haven't thought of using techniques that don't exist at the moment. And so it's the gift that keeps on giving.
NASA has even left some Apollo samples completely untouched for the last half-century, specifically waiting for new questions and new technologies. Through both the science that's already been done and the science to be done in the future, the Apollo lunar samples have proved their worth time and time again. Just ask Sarah Russell.
The Apollo rocks are absolutely, completely irreplaceable, and these samples are absolutely priceless.
But that does not stop some people from trying to put a price on them. Alan Rosen was not the first, and Thad Roberts wouldn't be the last. Anyone can buy a chunk of the moon, and it's perfectly legal so long as it didn't get here with any human help. Lunar meteorites will set you back about $100 or $200 per gram. But all of the Apollo samples officially belong to the United States, or in the case of the Goodwill rocks, to the nations they were given to. It is illegal for any individual to own any Apollo moon rock, but it is legal to sell space dust that has gathered on space artifacts. That's wild. In 1993, the auction house Sotheby's sold 3 specks of lunar dust from the USSR's Luna 16 sample return mission. Approximately 0.2 grams of material set the anonymous private collector back $442,500. Now, if that's outside your budget, you might be interested in paying just under $1,000 for a 3mm strip of tape with lunar dust on it, originally owned by a NASA photographer who got some dust on his fingers when he opened a film canister that Neil Armstrong dropped on the moon. Meanwhile, in 2018, a case of theft, fraud, and mistaken identity meant that an Apollo 11 collection bag ended up in the hands of a lawyer from Illinois named Nancy Lee Carlson. NASA tried to take it back, but Carlson won the case. She ended up selling the bag for $1.8 million and a pinch of lunar dust from inside of it for $500,000. But if you are headed to the black market to get your hands on some illegal stuff, the price is probably going to be even higher. Records of such underhanded dealings are unsurprisingly scarce, but a Nicaraguan Goodwill rock is rumored to have sold along with some other artifacts for $10 million. And space historian Robert Perlman has estimated that a Goodwill rock on its own could fetch up to $1 to $2 million at a public auction. But Alan Rosen, the guy offering a Central American Goodwill rock to John's estate sales, had gotten his for an absolute bargain. In 1995, a colonel sold it to him for $15,000 plus a refrigerated truck. Whichever way you look at them, their symbolism, scientific worth, or raw collector's appeal, moon rocks carry a far higher value than their gray, crusty exteriors would suggest. So Thad Roberts had plenty of reasons to get his hands on Gibson's samples back in 2002. Unlike Alan Rosen, who had a Goodwill rock 3 years before he saw Goodheinz's newspaper ad, Roberts wanted a buyer lined up before he so much as breathed on a stolen moon rock. That buyer turned out to be Axel Emmerman, a member of the Antwerp Mineralogical Club in Belgium. He told Roberts that he was interested but wanted proof of authenticity and to know how much Roberts was asking for. In May, Roberts promised this proof and offered a price as low as $300 per gram. However, he asked Emmerman to commit to buying at least 1 kilogram of the samples, in other words, at least $300,000. But when Emmerman didn't immediately respond, Roberts got nervous, started bombarding him with emails, assuring him of his intentions and pressuring him to commit. Eventually, the Belgian said he was willing to spend $100,000 but couldn't come to the US. Instead, Roberts would have to meet with his American sister-in-law, Lynn, who was also a mineral collector and would be able to authenticate the rocks on Emmerman's behalf. After a lengthy exchange of emails between Roberts and Lynn, the pair agreed to meet on July 20th in Orlando. The evening of Saturday, July 13th, Roberts, Fowler, and Sauer were ready for their historic heist. The 3 NASA interns drove to JSC in a Jeep Cherokee that Roberts had borrowed from a friend under the pretense that he was moving to a new apartment and needed the extra space. This was all going down during Roberts' 3rd tour at NASA, and he no longer worked in Building 31N, so the first hurdle was getting the code to enter the building. That turned out to be easy. All he had to do was lie to a colleague and claim he needed to process some photos in his old lab. Sauer stayed in the car, while Roberts and Fowler headed to Professor Gibson's lab, hitting hurdle number 2, a 5-button cipher lock on the door. That turned out to be an inconvenience, but not a complete deterrent. Roberts knew the code must be a combination of 4 of those 5 buttons without any repeats. So he simply worked his way through as many of the 232 possible combinations as he could until he found the right one. Once they got into Gibson's office, Roberts and Fowler ran into hurdle number 3, the locked safe containing their prize. But here's where their plan went awry. Roberts thought that the card he'd seen Gibson reference had the safe's code written on it, but it was actually Gibson's hint to himself for remembering the code. It was of no use to them, and the combination lock was harder to crack than the one on the door. So the 2 lovers had to go with plan B. They took the whole safe. Lifting it together onto a dolly, they wheeled it back to Sauer and the Jeep. The team loaded it up, drove off the campus without a single blink from security, and took it to a Motel 6 where they used power tools to break in. Say what you want about motels, but you really do get the privacy to do whatever you'd like. Inside the safe, the trio found more than 50 lunar samples, all stored inside vials and boxes in Teflon bags. In total, there were just over 100 grams of the moon in there. There were also around 150 meteorites, including 8 rare and valuable Martian meteorites. That's right, little bits that got blasted off the red planet and came crashing down to Earth. One of them was a piece of ALH 84001, a Martian meteorite that became famous for potentially containing alien microfossils. Roberts, Fowler, and Sauer, along with McWhorter hanging back in Utah, had hit the motherlode. In addition to the physical samples, Gibson's safe was also filled with documents that supported the identity of those samples, as well as their current state. Just the proof Roberts needed to convince his Belgian buyer that his rocks were legit. Over the course of the night, Fowler documented what they found and took photos of their progress. Then, the trio put the lunar samples and meteorites into a fishing tackle box and scattered the mangled safe across several dumpsters. Even with that hiccup involving Gibson's safe, it was a nearly perfect heist. No one had seen them come or go. The theft itself wasn't noticed until the following Monday. Gibson was in Australia at the time and received a call at 4 a.m. to tell him the terrible news. He came straight back to the US, but there was nothing he could do. There were no leads to follow. On July 19th, Roberts and Fowler started their drive from Houston to Orlando. Meanwhile, McWhorter flew in from Utah, keen for some of the excitement and for the money. The three met up at the Sheraton Hotel on the morning of July 20th and took their tackle box full of stolen moon rocks up to the room they'd booked. Then, depending on the sources you read, this bit is where things get a little steamy. Roberts has claimed he put the samples under the sheets of the bed and made love to Fowler on top of them so they could be the first people to have sex on the moon. That's not how it works, and also, that sounds uncomfortable. It's a good story, but later FBI photos showed the room with a perfectly made bed, which casts more than a little doubt on that claim. As the time for the sale approached, they slipped the tackle box under the hotel bed and headed to the Italian restaurant to meet their buyer. 4 years earlier, Alan Rosen had also agreed to sell his moon rock in Florida. Why is it always Florida? He arrived at a Miami bank expecting to meet a representative of John's estate sales. That representative, however, turned out to be an undercover US Customs agent who seized the rock and arrested Rosen. Joseph Goodhines and his team got their man. Once he had the plaque in hand, Goodhines could see that this Goodwill rock belonged to Honduras. But before anyone could celebrate, scientists had to confirm the rocks inside the lucite ball really were from the moon.
I put the moon rock in my pocket for about 24 hours and flew it back to Houston to be tested. And I had my briefcase, was doing a real good job putting it away in case anybody knew that we had the moon rock, but it sat in my pocket the entire time.
Back in Houston, NASA's lunar curator examined the piece.
Sure enough, our geologists could tell not only that it's from the moon, but which mission came from the moon. It was from our last mission there, Apollo 17.
All the Apollo 17 Goodwill rocks, turns out, were cut from a single rock named Sample 70017. Since some of the samples still existed, the lunar curator just needed to compare its chemical fingerprint to that of the seized rock. And they were identical. Despite having a genuine Goodwill rock and its seller in hand, the legal case that followed was long and messy. The crime actually came down more to customs than any kind of theft. Titled United States of America versus one lucite ball containing lunar material, one moon rock, and one 10-inch by 14-inch wooden plaque, the 5-year case examined whether Rosen actually had the right to sell the Honduran moon rock after he had bought it, and whether he'd declared it when he brought it into the country. The problem was, NASA gave over all rights to the Goodwill rocks when it gifted them to their recipient nations, and the agency made no effort to keep track of them afterwards. But they were always meant meant to be owned by the people, not to be traded for the leader's personal gain. So when the case finally went before a judge in 2003, it was the colonel's acquisition of the rock that was ruled illegal. That gave US Customs the right to seize it and allowed Alan Rosen to get off without being charged. The plaque was returned to Honduras and is now on public display, as originally intended. And Joseph Goodhines earned a NASA Exceptional Service Medal for leading the operation to retrieve it. But he wasn't even working for NASA at the time. A few years earlier, Goodhines had retired from the OIG and started working as a lawyer. By 2002, he was also teaching at the University of Phoenix and Alvin Community College, training the next generation of police detectives.
My mentor said, we encourage our instructors to teach what they know. And you were with NASA, and you're only guy from NASA OIG, and would love for you to give some sort of your background to the teaching.
But Goodhines didn't just teach. He also recruited his students into his own unofficial task force, because during Operation Lunar Eclipse, he realized just how many Goodwill rocks had disappeared.
When I realized that a lot of these countries had no clue where their moon rocks were, I encouraged my agency to do a broader investigation beyond Operation Lunar Eclipse. We didn't have the resources. We were a very small law enforcement agency. And so all of a sudden now I had graduate students learning to be criminal investigators. And I decided, why not give them a real task? I'm going to send them out there and we'll see how it goes.
Whether or not a student actually found a missing rock, at the end of their project, they'd have to either write a report or publish an editorial in a newspaper.
What I like about the moon rock cases is nobody's going to get hurt going after the moon rocks. And if they find a moon rock, people are going to benefit. Kids are going to see them in museums. I believe what NASA believes. I don't believe private individuals should own moon rocks or dust. I believe they belong to the people. Half my students would start off by going like, "Are you kidding? We're hunting for a moon rock." And about halfway through, they would be just as involved in it as I am.
While getting a bunch of college students to sniff out missing Apollo souvenirs might seem a bit ridiculous, Goodhines' project was actually a huge success. For one thing, the students were able to track down rocks that had simply been lost or misplaced. California's was found in storage at the San Diego Air and Space Museum, where the curators had forgotten they had it.
North Carolina, there was a moon rock found in a drawer. Nobody knows why it was there.
Canada's rock had been lost since 1978, but it turned up in a storage facility owned by Canada's Natural Science Museum.
My student, Kevin Griffiths, finds out that the Apollo 17 moon rock of Colorado is missing. There's a front page story out, and that day the governor, after 30-some years of having it, says, "I've had it on my wall the entire time." And now it sits at the Colorado School of the Mines.
But sometimes the rocks had actually been stolen. In 1973, an arsonist set fire to Alaska's State Transport Museum, which had been charged with displaying the state's Apollo 11 Goodwill rock. After one of Goodhines' students published her report in a local newspaper, unable to find the rock herself, a man came forward to sue Alaska. He claimed that he rescued the rock from the rubble during the cleanup and demanded he either be declared the legal owner of the rock or given $5 million. An FBI investigation revealed, however, that the plaque had gone missing sometime after the fire. The man, who'd been the foster son of the museum's curator at the time, returned the rock to the government, just like Alan Rosen, and he did not get his $5 million. But this was not the only theft Goodhines' students ran into.
I want to find Malta's Apollo 17 moon rock, because one of my students woke me up at 3 o'clock in the morning to tell me that it had been stolen from a museum, where someone walks in, opens up a case, takes the moon rock off the plaque and walks out.
Goodhines believes that that theft, which happened in 2004, was made by an opportunistic amateur. They only took the lucite ball and not the plaque that would prove its authenticity and its value. But despite offering amnesty and a $10,000 reward for its return, at the time we're filming this episode, there's still no sign of the Maltese rock. Losing a Goodwill rock is one thing, having it stolen is another, but the most dramatic cases might be the ones that feature future political unrest. Like in Romania, where a Goodwill rock wound up sold in an estate sale after the country's dictator and his wife were executed. Or in Cyprus, a Mediterranean island with an ongoing conflict between Christian Greeks in the north and Turkish Muslims in the south.
Cyprus allegedly was missing both of their moon rocks, believed destroyed in the fire when they were going through civil unrest in 1973.
But in 2009, when Gutein's students contacted them, the National Museum had never even heard of a Goodwill rock. It turned out that one had been sent to the island in 1973, but a year later, there was a coup attempt and an invasion. The president was ousted and the presidential palace burned to the ground. There was also violence at the American embassy, in which the ambassador was assassinated, likely before he had a chance to give the rock to Cyprus. Gutein's and his students worked with a Cyprus newspaper reporter to publish a media blitz demanding NASA investigate. Not long after, the agency was contacted by an attorney representing the rock's custodian. He was the son of an American diplomat, claiming his father took possession of the rock when the embassy was evacuated in 1974. In 2010, he handed it over in exchange for immunity from prosecution.
And then it took me another 12 years to get NASA to do the right thing to return it to Cyprus. And they didn't want to return it to Cyprus because of all the political turmoil, the politics, and everything else. And they forgot the whole reason why we gave these moon rocks in the first place. We weren't picking winners and losers. We were giving the moon rocks for the people of each country to enjoy. And just because Cyprus had some strife down there was no reason not to give them back their property.
It turns out the threat of prison time is enough to dissuade many people from trying to keep or sell an Apollo moon rock. Just not Thad Roberts. Lynn waited alone at her table for Orb Robinson to arrive, and when he finally did, she recognized him from the clothes he said he'd be wearing. But Orb, aka Roberts, was not the professional type she was expecting. Likely nervous, he talked a lot, boasting about how he'd broken into Building 31N and stolen the safe. At the end of his story, Roberts joked that he hoped she wasn't wearing a wire. But everything seemed to be going well. Lynn's husband, Kurt, soon joined them at the table, as did Fowler and McWhorter. Both sides of the deal judged the other as legitimate, and they agreed to the sale. They drove back to the Sheraton in 2 cars, but before they could even leave the parking lot, the FBI descended. Lynn had, in fact, been wearing a wire. Not only that, she herself worked for the FBI. Back in May, when Axel Emmerman first received Orb's emails, he nearly dismissed them as spam, but something nagged at him. Whatever Orb was doing was a crime. At best, it was fraud, and at worst, it was theft. So the mineral collector contacted the FBI in Tampa, where Orb said he was based. The entire time he was emailing Orb, he was also coordinating with investigators. The FBI was able to analyze Orb's emails and found they weren't coming from anywhere in Tampa or Florida for that matter. Sometimes they originated from the University of Utah, and sometimes from Johnson Space Center. They didn't start asking around NASA though, because if this were an inside job, they could spook the perpetrator. But they did have their eyes on a couple of Utah professors who also worked at JSC. And they eventually teamed up with NASA's investigators once they both realized they were investigating the same case. They still had no idea it was an intern they should be looking for though. It was the FBI who suggested Emmerman schedule a meetup on American soil to lead Orb, whoever he was, into a trap. And to help sell the ruse, they recruited Special Agent Lynn Billings, who had trained as a geologist. Her fake husband, Kurt, whose real name is Lawrence, was also an FBI agent and learned a single line of Flemish to play his role. In the event that Lynn needed to confirm the moon rocks were legitimate, Emmerman told her to look for zap pits. On the moon, tiny particles constantly rain down from space, but without an atmosphere to slow them down, they hit the surface going as fast as 80,000 kilometers per hour. They're basically microscopic meteorites, creating correspondingly tiny impact craters called zap pits. They have a surface of black glass surrounded by a white halo of pulverized rock, and every moon rock is covered in them. Although the pits themselves can be faked, the unique textures within them cannot. Thad's zap rat pit-covered rocks were found right where he had left them, in the fishing tackle box under the bed in room 905. The trio of criminals who had come to Florida were arrested then and there. 2 days later, Sauer was arrested in Houston. Professor Gibson got all of his moon rocks and meteorites back, and the 4 criminals were charged with conspiracy to steal, transport, and sell government property. But to determine how severe their punishments would be, prosecutors needed to calculate the value of what they had stolen, and instead of going by black market rumors or a few legal sales, the FBI used the cost of the Apollo missions themselves. In 1961, Kennedy announced that the space program would cost every US citizen 50 cents per week. The final total was more than $25 billion. Now, not all of that went towards bringing moon rocks to Earth, of course, so the government's number crunchers only took into account what proportion of each mission was dedicated to sample return. For instance, every gram of material removed from the lunar surface needed 3 extra grams of propellant. Eventually, they arrived at $50,800 per gram at the time, or $203,000 per gram in 2003, and a total of $21 million for the moon rocks that Roberts and company stole. The meteorites added even more to the sticker price. The famous ALH 84001 sample from Mars was valued at $1.8 million all by itself. NASA's cost analyst pegged the total replacement cost for all the samples at $32 million. That's a lot of money for what Roberts claimed was a victimless crime, giving trash lunar samples a new lease on life. But Roberts had just conveniently ignored the fact that while contaminated samples can't be used for everything scientists want to study, that doesn't mean they're completely useless. As we've heard from Professor Russell, experiments are done outside of the Lunar Sample Laboratory's pristine environment all the time. You just have to be very careful and keep track of everything you did to them, so future scientists know what to account for in their research. And honestly, Thad, scientists do research on lunar meteorites, which have gone through the atmosphere and burned up a little bit. Obviously, these things are still valuable. To date, only about 20% of all Apollo rocks have been so degraded that they have no scientific use. However, the indiscriminate handling of these stolen samples created a different type of contamination, a broken chain of custody that had started the moment the astronauts selected the rock on the moon's surface. The 4 students had personally handled the rocks, and there are even reports that one of them ate some. Without knowing which samples had been affected and to what degree, the event basically ended these rocks' scientific careers. But even then, they wouldn't be considered trash. They would still be used for education and outreach. As it turns out, the most damage wasn't done to the rocks themselves. Professor Gibson reported that his stolen safe also contained 30 years worth of handwritten research notes, and while the lunar samples were recovered from the Orlando Sheraton, there was no sign of those notes. Roberts maintained that he never saw them, but Fowler's photographs taken the night they broke into the safe clearly show them lying on the floor of the motel room. When this information came to light during Roberts' trial, the judge weighed it heavily.
I mean, if you don't have notes on what you did, then basically it may as well never have happened. If you don't write about it, then no one will ever know that you did this work. And many of these analyses are destructive analyses. So, unfortunately, you have to destroy bits of the rock to be able to get this data. And once it's gone, and you can never get it back.
In the end, a hearing set the official cost of the theft at $7 million for loss of research and productivity. But to deal out the punishments, the courts considered each student's contributions to the theft and sale. Both Fowler and Sauer got off fairly lightly. They were sentenced to 3 years probation with 6 months house arrest, 150 hours of community service, and $9,000 restitution. McWhorter ended up making life harder for himself. He went against his attorney's advice and pleaded not guilty to the charges, meaning he was the only one to go to trial, and then he jumped bail. At his trial, the witnesses who testified against him included FBI agents, a former Apollo astronaut, NASA's lunar sample curator, and Thad Roberts and Tiffany Fowler. So much for him and Roberts being friends. Ultimately, McWhorter was sentenced to 5 years, 10 months at a federal correctional institution in Colorado. But as you might expect, Roberts bore the brunt brunt of the blame. The prosecutors even threw in a charge for the stolen museum fossils. But because of those missing notebooks, his sentence ended up being nearly double what the sentencing guidelines suggested. In 2003, he was sentenced to 8 years, 4 months in prison, plus 3 years probation and 150 hours of community service. He ended up spending 6 years behind bars.
Even though I'm a defense attorney now, I still have that old law enforcement thing, and you go into hollow ground, you're giving the privilege to do so, and you steal from not only the United States, but the world, because you're greedy or you're whatever. I don't think 8 years was enough. I would have put him in for 20.
It's been 23 years since Thad Roberts and his crew stole a safe full of moon rocks and meteorites, and 27 years since Joseph Goodhines first embarked on his quest to hunt down the missing Goodwill rocks. And while some of the characters have since steered clear of the limelight, Roberts is not among them. During his years in prison, he taught himself physics. He became especially interested in quantum physics and now publishes and speaks on the subject occasionally. Although we weren't able to find any of his work that has made it through peer review, and our attempts to reach Roberts through his social media and email accounts for this story were not successful. Fowler and Sauer understandably have kept a low profile since their headline-grabbing escapades. Despite their passionate love affair, Fowler never spoke to Roberts again after they were caught. McWhorter claims his prison time saved him from a downward spiral of drug use. He's now an author and a father to several children. Joseph Goodhines eventually retired from teaching and is currently focusing on his work as a defense lawyer at a firm with his sons. But he will never let go of the missing Goodwill rocks.
Right now, there are about 159 of these moon rocks still missing. But we helped recover 78. When I retire, my wife and I are going to go worldwide. We're going to go hunt down every moon rock that's still out there that we're missing.
NASA has acknowledged that hundreds of rocks that it's loaned to researchers have been lost or stolen over the years, but these still make up a tiny fraction of the whole Apollo lunar collection. Meanwhile, the agency did tighten its inventory controls and introduced more stringent security requirements, including that office safes must now be bolted down. But without Goodhines, there's never quite been the same determination to chase the missing Apollo moon rocks. Which is a shame. But the truth is, if we want to keep learning about the moon, we need to move beyond what we gathered during the Apollo missions. Although those samples transformed planetary science, they can't tell us everything we need to know.
The Apollo missions only sampled a very tiny part of the moon. So they only visited the near side of the moon, and they only went to the equator of the moon. So that means we still know very little about the polar regions and also the far side of the moon.
Some of that new sampling has already started. In 2020 and 2024, China launched 2 robotic sample return missions named Chang'e 5 and 6 respectively, and together they've brought back over 3.5 kilograms of lunar material. That's about the weight of 2 2-kilogram hand weights. It's a little less. India is planning to launch their Chandrayaan 4 lander in 2029 and collect 3 kilos near the moon's south pole. And then, of course, there are the much-anticipated private missions, which have the potential to change the landscape of lunar science altogether.
We're sort of on the cusp of a really exciting time because there's so much interest in returning to the moon. And, for most of my professional life, lunar science was sort of bit in the doldrums, but now there's real interest again in having human beings going back to the moon.
The Apollo moon rocks were special for decades because they were among the only ones we had. But what will always make them valuable is the fact that they represent a unique period of history when we first reached for the stars, a time when humanity chose exploration over annihilation. For some, like the custodians of the lost Goodwill rocks, that might not mean much. But for others, like Joseph Goodhines, and maybe even in his own way Thad Roberts, it means an awful lot.
I gotta tell you, walking around with a moon rock for 24 hours in my pocket, I'm going like, yeah, that's connection to something bigger than myself, bigger than any of us.